In the early years of the Pacific War, the sky belonged to Japan. When Japanese aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they did more than destroy ships and airfields. They shattered a myth. The myth that American industrial power alone could guarantee air superiority. In the months that followed, Japanese naval aviation dominated the Pacific with terrifying efficiency, and at the center of that dominance was a single aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was unlike anything the Allies had encountered. It was light, agile, and possessed a range that stunned Western planners. Japanese pilots could strike targets hundreds of miles away, fight, and still return to their carriers. In dogfights, the Zero could outturn almost every American fighter in the sky. Early encounters ended the same way again and again. American pilots tried to maneuver with the Zero and paid for it with their lives. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to the Coral Sea, Japanese air power carved open Allied defenses. U.S. Navy pilots flying outdated F6F Hellcats quickly learned a brutal lesson. Speed and firepower meant nothing if you couldn't survive the first turn. The Zero danced through American formations, its pilots often veterans of years of combat in China. They were confident, disciplined, and deadly. By mid-1942, the psychological balance of the air war had shifted. Japanese pilots believed, with good reason, that they were superior. Many openly mocked American aircraft, calling them heavy, clumsy, and poorly designed. In contrast, the Zero felt like an extension of the pilot's body. Could climb faster, turn tighter, and strike first. To the men flying it, the sky felt secure. Even American commanders were forced to admit the truth. Loss rates were unsustainable. Dogfighting the Japanese on their terms was suicide. The U.S. Navy began issuing strict orders. Never turn with a Zero. Hit and run. Use teamwork. Use altitude. These tactics kept pilots alive, but they did not restore dominance. The Battle of Midway slowed Japan's advance, but it did not end Japanese control of the air. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, the Zero remained a threat that shaped every American operation. Carrier groups planned missions around avoiding Japanese fighters, not confronting them. In the early years of the Pacific War, the sky belonged to Japan. When Japanese aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they did more than destroy ships and airfields. They shattered a myth. The myth that American industrial power alone could guarantee air superiority. In the months that followed, Japanese naval aviation dominated the Pacific with terrifying efficiency, and at the center of that dominance was a single aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was unlike anything the Allies had encountered. It was light, agile, and possessed a range that stunned Western planners. Japanese pilots could. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was not born from theory or pride. It was born from defeat. By 1942, the U.S. Navy had learned a hard truth in the skies over the Pacific. The Mitsubishi Zero was not just better. It was killing experienced American pilots faster than they could be replaced. Reports from surviving aviators were blunt. The Zero outturned them, climbed faster. It seemed untouchable in a close fight. Something radically different was needed. Grumman's engineers did not try to outmaneuver the Zero. Instead, they asked a far more dangerous question. How do you kill it? The answer reshaped everything. The Hellcat was built around raw power and survivability. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, over 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what the Zero could rely on. This gave the Hellcat speed, climb, and the ability to choose when to fight or disengage. If things went wrong, the Hellcat could simply leave. Unlike the Zero, the Hellcat was armored. Its cockpit was protected by steel plating. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Pilots could take hits and still fly home, something Japanese aviators rarely experienced. This alone changed the psychology of combat. American pilots could be aggressive without gambling their lives on a single mistake. Firepower was another revelation. 6.50 caliber machine guns gave the Hellcat crushing punch. A brief burst was often enough to rip a Zero apart. Japanese aircraft, built light and unprotected, could not absorb that kind of damage. The Hellcat didn't need to dance. It needed only one good firing pass. But perhaps the most important difference was doctrine. The Hellcat was designed to work as part of a system. Radar-guided interception, coordinated formations, altitude advantage, and disciplined tactics turned individual fighters into a lethal machine. Pilots were trained to boom and zoom, to strike from above, and to refuse turning fights entirely. The aircraft didn't demand aces, it created them. Japanese pilots quickly noticed the change. Where Wildcats had struggled, Hellcats hunted. Zeros that once ruled the sky now found themselves unable to escape or outfight their new enemy. If they turned, they were outgunned. If they ran, they were outpaced. If they climbed, they were intercepted. By 1943, the balance had shifted. Japanese veterans spoke with respect and fear of the new American fighter. The Hellcat was not elegant. It was not graceful, but it was relentless. This was not an aircraft built to impress. It was built with one purpose: to find the Zero and destroy it. When the Hellcat first appeared over the Pacific in late 1943, Japanese pilots did not immediately understand what they were facing. At a distance, it looked like just another American carrier fighter, large, bulky, and surely clumsy. Many veterans believed it would fall like the Wildcat before it. They were wrong. The first real test came during raids over Marcus Island and later in the skies above the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Japanese pilots climbed confidently to intercept incoming American formations, expecting familiar results. Instead, they encountered something entirely new. The Hellcat did not turn with them. It struck from above. American pilots dove with crushing speed, fired short, lethal bursts, and climbed away before the Japanese could react. Zeros tried to follow, only to discover they could not catch up. The familiar advantage, agility, meant nothing when the enemy refused to play the old game. Japanese after-action reports began to change tone. Pilots described American fighters that absorbed hits and kept flying. Cannon shells that would have crippled a Zero barely slowed the new enemy. One pilot wrote that firing felt like striking iron with bare hands. The shock deepened during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japanese aircrews launched wave after wave against American carrier groups, believing numbers would overwhelm technology. What followed became known among U.S. pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hellcats, guided by radar and fighter direction officers, intercepted Japanese aircraft long before they reached the fleet. For Japanese pilots, the experience was terrifying. Hellcats attacked from high altitude, from the sun, from blind angles. Radio calls turned to panic. Squadrons vanished in minutes. Many pilots never even saw the aircraft that killed them. Those who survived spoke of helplessness. Zeros tried to dive, Hellcats followed. They tried to climb, Hellcats were already above them. They tried to turn. Machine gun fire tore through wings and fuselages. This was the moment Japanese aviators realized something fundamental had changed. Air combat was no longer a contest of individual skill. It was now a system, technology, training, and coordination working as one. Perhaps the most devastating realization was psychological. The Hellcat did not fear the Zero. American pilots pressed attacks aggressively, confident their aircraft would protect them. Losses were replaced quickly. Experience accumulated. Meanwhile, Japan's elite pilots, men trained for years, were being erased in hours. Veterans later recalled the first time they faced the Hellcat as the moment hope began to fade. Not because one battle was lost, but because the future was suddenly clear. This was not a temporary setback. This was the beginning of the end. The skies that once belonged to Japan were no longer theirs. And the pilots who survived knew it. The war in the air had turned. For years, Japanese naval pilots had relied on a simple truth. If things went wrong, they could escape. The The Zero could outturn almost anything, climb quickly, and slip away from danger through skill and maneuver. Survival depended on options. The Hellcat erased those options. By 1944, encounters with American fighters followed a terrifying pattern. Japanese pilots would spot enemy aircraft above them, already a bad sign. Hellcats dove with overwhelming speed, firing before the Zero could react. Instinctively, Japanese pilots tried to turn tightly, trusting muscle memory built from countless victories. It no longer worked. The Hellcat did not chase turns. It climbed back up, repositioned, and attacked again. Every maneuver the Zero relied on had a counter, and often several. Diving away was useless. The Hellcat's weight and power gave it superior speed in a dive. Climbing was worse. The American fighter's engine simply outperformed the Zero at higher altitudes. Worst of all, the Hellcat could take punishment. Japanese pilots reported hitting American aircraft repeatedly, only to watch them keep flying. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Armor protected pilots who would have been instantly killed in a Zero. The psychological effect was devastating. What once felt like a duel now felt like fighting a machine that refused to die. Escape had always been the Zero's final advantage. When combat turned unfavorable, a skilled pilot could disengage and live to fight another day. Against the Hellcat, there was nowhere to go. American tactics made this even deadlier. Hellcats rarely flew alone. They worked in pairs or larger formations, covering each other relentlessly. If one Hellcat missed, another was already lining up the shot. Japanese pilots found themselves trapped in layered attacks, unable to isolate a single opponent. Radio intercepts and survivor accounts tell the same story. Confusion, frustration, and fear. Pilots described the sky as closed, with no safe direction to flee. Even experienced aces realized that skill alone could not overcome physics, armor, and numbers. By the time of the Philippine Sea and later battles over the Philippines, Japanese pilots understood the truth. Every traditional advantage had been stripped away. Agility meant nothing without speed. Experience meant little without protection. Courage could not replace fuel, engines, and coordination. Some pilots still fought bravely, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Encounters with Hellcats became exercises in survival rather than victory. Many pilots focused not on winning, but on simply returning to base, if that was even possible. For the first time in the war, Japanese aviators faced an enemy that controlled every variable. Altitude, speed, engagement distance, and escape routes all belonged to the Hellcat. There was no clever maneuver left. No safe direction to turn. No way out. The skies had become a trap, and the Hellcat held the key. By late 1944, numbers began to tell a story that Japanese pilots already felt in their bones. It was no longer rumor or propaganda, it was mathematics. Against the F6F Hellcat, the kill ratio had reached an astonishing 19-1. For every Hellcat lost, 19 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. For the men still flying for Japan, this was not just a statistic. It was a death sentence written in advance. Veteran pilots spoke of a growing dread before missions. Engines started, canopies closed, and yet many already believed they would not return. The Hellcat had turned the sky into hostile territory, even over areas Japan once controlled. Escort fighters stayed with American bombers from takeoff to target and back again. There were no gaps, no weak points, no moment of relief. The Zero, once a symbol of dominance, now represented vulnerability. Pilots knew their aircraft could not absorb damage. A single burst could tear through wings, ignite fuel, or kill the pilot instantly. Meanwhile, Hellcats returned with holes in their fuselages, shattered panels, and wounded pilots who survived to fly again. The imbalance crushed morale. New Japanese pilots entered combat with minimal training, facing opponents who had hundreds of flight hours, radar support, and superior machines. Many were shot down in their first engagement, sometimes without ever seeing the enemy. Survivors described Hellcats appearing suddenly from the sun, firing with brutal precision, then vanishing back into the clouds. Fear spread quickly through the ranks. Pilots whispered warnings to one another. Some delayed takeoffs. Others flew defensively from the moment they left the ground, already expecting attack. The confidence that once defined Japanese naval aviation was gone. American pilots, by contrast, sensed the shift immediately. They noticed fewer aggressive maneuvers, more desperate turns, more pilots diving away instead of engaging. The Hellcat did not just win battles, it broke the fighting spirit of its enemy. The collapse was inevitable. By 1945, Japanese aviation was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, lack of spare parts, and exhausted airframes compounded the disaster. The skies belonged entirely to the United States. The Hellcat had not merely replaced the Zero, it had ended an era of Japanese air superiority forever. Historians often debate tactics and technology, but the men who flew knew the truth. The war in the air ended long before the war on the ground. The 19-to-1 ratio was not just evidence of superiority, it was proof that one side could no longer fight on equal terms. When Japanese pilots looked up and saw the broad wings and dark blue shape of a Hellcat, they understood what history would later confirm. The battle was already decided. The age of the Zero was over, and the sky would never belong to them again.